The anthropology professor has a dirty little secret, and I know it. The last time I snuck onto campus after school hours to complete a fraternity test, I swore to myself that it would be the last time I did something that stupid, simply because the risks involved were way too much for a scholarship student like myself to cater to if things went south and I was caught. It had been 2 years since my frat trial, but somehow I found myself sneaking through the campus's dark hallways tonight as I frantically searched Dr. Amir's lecture room for a concordance I have left behind earlier in the day during his morning lecture. I needed it for an assignment. I would have to turn in by morning, and I couldn't even afford to wing it because the assignment was worth 45 marks. While it might not seem like much, it would make or break my CGPA this semester. So I couldn't afford to leave anything to chance. I had to go and get it. With my flashlight reduced to the very minimum, I searched the general area I had sat down in during the class, and unsurprisingly, the concordance was nowhere to be found. I spent a few more minutes pursuing the rows of desks and chairs before it dawned on me that somebody else must have picked it up, and the chances that it was a fellow student were pretty slim because I was always one of the last people to leave the class each time. I liked having a few extra minutes to observe Dr. Amir in his element. The man was as handsome as he was intelligent, a very sexy combo in my books. If only he hit the gym often, then he would have been perfect. Like most students on campus, I'd had a crush on Dr. Amir since day one. He was the perfect blend of genius and kindness, and then there was this old money vibe he gave off whenever he was in lecture mode. It was as though he went out of his way to make his students swoon each time he talked. If I were Dr. Amir, where would I keep a recovered source material? I gently whispered to myself as I scanned the entire room with my dim flashlight. An imaginary light bulb went off above my head, and the moment my flashlight landed on his desk a few yards away, of course, he would keep something like that in his desk. That was the only logical course of action. That was if he didn't take it home altogether. The man was a bookworm obsessed with research. I wouldn't be surprised if he was at home right now curled up with a cup of coffee, perusing the content of my concordance. I eventually found the concordance in Dr. Amir's first desk drawer, and I let out a heavy sigh of relief. Just as I was about to shut the drawer and make a quick exit, a metallic glint caught my eye. There, sitting innocently in the drawer half covered by documents, was Dr. Amir's laptop. "No way," I silently hissed, my heart rate aggressively picking up as I brushed my hand against the sleek surface of the device. He never parted with this. He always stuck it right back into his little bag the moment he concluded lectures. How had he left without it? I knew I should leave immediately, but curiosity gnawed at me. What could be on Dr. Amir's laptop? My mind raced with possibilities. There was no way it wasn't password protected, I reasoned. Still, the temptation was too strong to resist. I had to know. With trembling hands, I opened the laptop. To my astonishment, the screen lit up without prompting for a password or a PIN. My eyes widened in disbelief. This was too easy. I hesitated for a moment, a small conflict raging in my mind. This was an invasion of privacy, but I couldn't stop myself. I clicked through the files, my heart pounding louder with each second. Then something caught my eye. A folder labeled Swinger. My breath caught in my throat as I opened it. Inside were intimate images of Dr. Amir. My professor, the man I had admired, respected, and crushed on, was laid bare before me. I felt my cheeks burn with a mix of guilt and arousal. This was too much. I needed to stop, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Among the images was a screenshot of a profile on his dating app called Swing Out. My heart skipped a beat as I realized it was a gay dating app. Dr. Amir's profile was there, clear as day. His pictures, his interests, everything. The reality hit me like a truck. Dr. Amir was gay and he was on a dating app seeking men. I closed the laptop, my mind reeling from the discovery. The images, the profile, they all swirled in my head, warring against everything I thought I knew about Dr. Amir. I had always assumed he was straight, especially since he was engaged to the dean's daughter, but this changed everything. This meant I had a slim chance with him, if I played my cards right. 2 days later. Over the next 2 days, I couldn't shake the images from my mind. Every time I looked at Dr. Amir during his lectures, the lewd images would overlap with his real-life form. I would find my mind wandering. His voice now sent shivers down my spine for entirely different reasons now. All I could think about these days was being with him. My concentration naturally faltered and my classes bore the brunt of it. Notes turned into mindless scribbles, and my once clear thought trail became muddled with fantasies and the undeniable reality of what I had discovered. I knew I had to do something, anything. I couldn't keep living in this torturous limbo, unable to focus on my studies or think about anything but Dr. Amir's secret life. I had to take a shot, no matter how risky it seemed to be. After today's particularly grueling lecture, I decided to stay back. My heart rapidly kicked against my ribs as the classroom emptied, students filing out one by one until it was just Dr. Amir and me. He glanced up from his desk, eyebrows raised in a mild surprise. "Yusuf, can I help you with something?" he asked, his tone polite but weary. By now, he had to have known that the concordance was no longer in his desk and that there was a possibility that whoever had retrieved it had looked through his computer. I swallowed hard. My throat suddenly dry at the thought of this going sideways. "Yes, Professor. I'm having trouble with some of the material from today's lecture. I was hoping you could help me out a bit." He nodded, motioning for me to come closer. I laid out my notebook, pointing to a particularly tricky passage we had touched on today. Dr. Amir leaned in close as he hunched over the notebook. His proximity made my pulse quicken, but I had to ignore it, for now. After a few seconds of staring at it, he began to break it down. His explanation was swift and precise, as always. Within minutes, he had entirely untangled the problem for me. "Is there anything else?" he asked, starting to gather his things, clearly ready to leave. Panic surged through me. This was my chance. "Actually, there is," I blurted out, my voice trembling towards the end. Dr. Amir paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What is it, Yusuf?" I took a deep breath and held it. I found your profile," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Online, on Swing Out." His face went pale, the color draining rapidly as the words sank in. He took a step back in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" "I saw your profile on Swing Out, and the pictures. I know," I stammered, the words stumbling out before I could stop them. For a moment there was silence. Then Dr. Amir's eyes hardened. "You had no right." I know, I interrupted, desperation coloring my voice. "I shouldn't have looked, but I did, and now I can't stop thinking about it. About you." Dr. Amir looked at me like I had lost my mind. Just as he was about to tell me off, the alarm on his digital wristwatch went off. He shook his head, clearly struggling to maintain his composure now. "We can't talk about this right now. I have a staff meeting to attend," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Meet me in my office during lunch. We'll discuss this then." I watched him storm out of the lecture hall silently. Never in my years of learning from him had I seen him so frustrated. I liked the fact that I could evoke such strong emotions from him. 20 minutes later. I didn't have to wait long. Barely 20 minutes had passed before Dr. Amir joined me in his private office. The professor looked more tired than frustrated now. Whatever had transpired during the meeting seemed to have drained him completely. The moment his eyes landed on me, a small frown formed on his lips. "Yusuf," he began, his voice heavy with weariness. "This is a serious matter." I nodded, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. The office felt smaller now, more confined, as if the walls were closing in around our conversation. Dr. Amir took a seat behind his desk, rubbing his temples as if trying to ward off an impending headache. "You shouldn't have snooped through my laptop," he said, his tone stern but not unkind. "I know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't have, but I did, and now I can't unsee it." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Yusuf, this is serious. If anyone else found out—" "They won't," I interrupted. "I won't tell anyone, but I need to understand. You're engaged to the dean's daughter when you prefer men." Dr. Amir's eyes hardened slightly, the frustration giving way to determination. "That's none of your business," he said after a long pause. I raised my hand in surrender. "I guess I'll go asking around and find my own answers then." Dr. Amir's eyes widened at the thought. "God damn it, fine, I'll tell you, but you have to promise me that this stays between us. No one else can know." I nodded eagerly, leaning forward, eager to hear his story. He took a deep breath, his eyes distant as he began to speak. "I am being strong-armed into the marriage," he confessed. "The dean's daughter. It's all part of a deal. The dean funds my research. My entire career depends on his financial support. Without it, I am nothing." I felt a pang of sympathy for him. The image of the confident, intelligent professor crumbled before my eyes, revealing a man trapped by circumstances beyond his control. "But why marry her?" I asked, struggling to understand. "Why not find another way?" "It's not that simple," he replied, his voice tinged with bitterness. "The dean believes I'm most suited to marry his genius of a daughter, plus his influence extends far beyond this university. He could ruin my career in a heartbeat." Silence hung between us, heavy and oppressive. I could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of the decision he had been forced to make. "Remember, Yusuf, you can't speak of this to anyone," he whispered, locking his gaze with mine. "Go on a date with me, and you'd have yourself a deal." Dr. Amir's eyes widened in shock. "What?" "You heard me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Go on a date with me, and I will take your secrets to the great beyond." He shook his head, a mix of disbelief and frustration. "Yusuf, we can't. I'm your professor. You're my student. This isn't right." "Nobody has to know," I said, my resolve hardening. "I like you, Dr. Amir, and I know you have a soft spot for me." He opened his mouth to argue, but then closed it, a flicker of something passing over his face. "I need time to think about this," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, standing up. "Take all the time you need. I'll see you in class, Professor," I said as I threw a wave over my shoulders and exited his office. 1 week later. The next couple of days were an intimate study in tension. Dr. Amir tried to pretend that our conversation that day never happened. He carried on with his lectures, his gaze expertly dodging mine as much as possible, but I could see through the facade. He was avoiding the issue, hoping it would go away if he ignored it long enough. I realized that if I didn't act, he would comfortably move on, burying his desire under layers of academic duties and obligations. So, I took matters into my own hands. Subtly, I began teasing Dr. Amir in class, making suggestive eye contact here and there while he lectured, letting my gaze linger just a bit too long. Every time our eyes met, I let out a small, knowing smile play on my lips. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. He was rattled. By the end of the week, he couldn't ignore me any longer. As the last student left the lecture hall, Dr. Amir called my name. "Yusuf, can you stay behind for a moment?" I nodded, my heart racing as I made my way to the front of the room. He now looked tired, the strain of the week catching up to him. "Yusuf," he began, frustration and wariness prominent in his voice. "You need to stop this. Whatever it is you're trying to do, it's not appropriate." I met his gaze unwavering. "I asked you for a date, Dr. Amir, and you still haven't given me an answer." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "This is complicated. You're my student. There are boundaries that shouldn't be crossed." "Then let's make it simple," I replied, stepping closer. "I'm not asking you to break any rules. Just give me a chance. One evening. That's all I'm asking for." He stared at me, his resolve weakening. "Fine," he said finally, "but not a date. We'll meet up to tackle an anthropology problem, that's it." I smiled, knowing I had won a small victory here. "Deal. The library this weekend." "Fine," Dr. Amir sighed, waving me towards the door. The following day. Saturday evening found us at the library surrounded by books and the quiet hum of planed reading lights. We dove into our work without much hassle. I had already strong-armed the man into a much-needed date. I wasn't going to ask any more from him. For our task today, I had sourced a small problem from some past questions I borrowed from the city's archives, and I was pleasantly surprised by how easily we both fell into a rhythm. Dr. Amir was brilliant, and I had to be on my A-game to keep up with his razor-sharp mind. As the hours slipped by, the library slowly began to clear out, leaving us alone in the vast silent space. After a few more hours of tackling problems, we began putting our materials away, our conversation flowing easily now that the earlier tension had been replaced by a measure of familiarity. "I have to admit," Dr. Amir said, placing a stack of books back on the shelf, "your shenanigans aside, you're quite the student, Yusuf. Your insights are impressive." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me at his praise. "Thank you, Professor. I've always enjoyed your classes. You're the kind of intellectual I hope to be someday." We continued talking as we cleaned up, our conversation drifting from anthropology to more personal topics, and by the time we were ready to leave, I felt a spark I had to capitalize on. I looked up at him, my heart pounding. "Dr. Amir Zahir," I corrected myself, testing out the intimacy of his first name. He met my gaze, his dark eyes searching mine. "Yusuf," he began. But whatever he was going to say was lost as I stepped closer, my hand brushing against his. The touch was rousing, sending a shiver all the way down my spine. Before I could second-guess myself, I leaned in and pressed my lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, a light brush of lips, but then it quickly deepened, a hungry urgency taking over. Dr. Amir responded in kind, his hands finding their way to my waist, pulling me closer as the light kiss turned into a savage duel of passion. 1 week later. The kiss with Dr. Amir changed everything between us. It was evident that he had needed this outlet, this connection as much as I did. The tension that had been simmering between us finally found its release, and it was exhilarating. The week that followed only intensified the attraction between us. We found stolen moments between classes, exchanging heated glances and secret touches that left us both breathless. It was a dangerous game, but the thrill of it only made us crave each other more. One afternoon, we found ourselves alone in Dr. Amir's office. The door was locked, the blinds drawn, and the air was thick with anticipation. As our lips met again, our hands roamed freely, the urgency of our desire taking over. We were lost in each other and wanted to go as far as possible. Just as things were reaching a height, a sharp knock at the door snapped us back to reality. We scrambled to put ourselves in order, straightening our clothes and catching our breath. Dr. Amir shot me a panicked look. I quickly moved to a chair, trying to look as composed as possible. "Come in," Dr. Amir called out, his voice slightly strained. The door opened to reveal a woman standing there. It was Dr. Amir's fiancée, the dean's daughter. She was elegant and poised, her demeanor icy cold, and she looked at Dr. Amir, then shifted her gaze to me. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Zahir," she said, her voice clipped and formal. "I need to speak with you." "Of course, Layla," Dr. Amir replied, his tone respectful but tense. "This is Yusuf, one of my students." Layla's eyes flicked to me again, her expression dismissive. "Nice to meet you," she said curtly, before turning her attention back to Dr. Amir. "I just wanted to remind you that now that I'm in town, we need to meet with the school board soon, preferably over dinner." Dr. Amir nodded, his posture stiff. "Yes, of course. I'll make the arrangements." "Good," Layla said, her gaze lingering on him a moment longer. There was an unspoken tension between them. "I'll see you tonight, then." With that, she turned and left the room, closing the door behind her. The silence that followed was thick. I looked at Dr. Amir, who seemed deflated. "I'm sorry," I said softly, reaching out to touch his arm. "I didn't mean to complicate things for you." He shook his head, a sad smile tugging at his lips. "It's not your fault, Yusuf. This is complicated, yes, but I can't deny that I wouldn't change a thing if I could. I felt more alive this week than I have in years." I nodded, understanding his words. That's precisely what I was aiming for. Dr. Amir took my hand in his, squeezing it gently. "Thank you, Yusuf." I smiled at him as I gathered my things to leave. "I guess we'd pick this up some other time then." "Definitely," Dr. Amir responded without missing a beat. 2 weeks later. I came to realize that despite Amir promising to see me later, he had begun seeing me less and less. It wasn't looking like we were going to meet up any further. It had been 2 horrible weeks since his fiancée had almost caught us in his office. Layla being in town might have spooked him. I was bummed out, knowing Layla's presence was putting distance between us. I could tell Amir was avoiding me, probably trying to keep everything under wraps after our close call. I couldn't blame him, but I still needed to see him. Determined to satisfy my urge, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I need to see Dr. Amir and convince him not to marry her because he would be miserable and it would break my heart. After some asking around, I found out where he lived and made my way there one evening, determined to talk to him. When I arrived, I knocked on the door with urgency. I didn't want to be spotted outside his home. The door opened, and there stood Layla, her expression icy as ever as she looked at me. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone clipped. "I need to speak with Dr. Amir," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Layla's eyes narrowed. "I know who you are," she said quietly. "I know you're Amir's plaything, but you should know that if I ever see you around him again, I'll have you expelled, understand?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stood there, stunned and speechless. As she slammed the door in my face, defeated, I turned and walked away. I was so confused. Had Amir confessed? Had he told her about us? Was he done with me? 2 days later, those questions tormented me for the next couple of days. More than ever, I needed to speak with Amir. My prayers were answered when I ran into him at the restroom, and the air between us was awkward and tense. Amir looked tired, his eyes wary as he washed his hands. When he eventually registered my presence, it was clear that he would rather be anywhere but here right now. "Amir," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "did you know she knows about us?" Amir turned to face me. "What are you talking about?" "Layla," I continued. "She told me she knows. She threatened to have me expelled if I didn't stay away from you." Amir's expression darkened. "She did what?" I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Please, Amir, don't marry her. You're going to regret it." Amir shook his head, his face filled with a measure of anger. "Yusuf, you don't understand. This marriage, it's necessary for my research, for my career. Without the dean's support, everything I've worked for will be for nothing." "But what about us?" I desperately pleaded. "What about what we have?" Amir closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. "I care about you, Yusuf. More than you know, but this is bigger than us." My heart broke at his words. It felt like the floor had been snatched from underneath my feet. "You should get back to class, Yusuf," Dr. Amir said, leading the way out. As we exited the restroom, we ran into Layla. Her eyes flicked between us, her expression cruel and unreadable. "Yusuf," she said coolly, "I believe you have a class to attend." Amir gave me a pleading look. "Go, Yusuf, I'll handle this." 3 days later. The next 3 days somehow managed to become even more unbearable. Dr. Amir barely came to class, his TA always filling in for him. He only popped in briefly, and it was usually with Layla or the dean in tow. I was heartbroken beyond words, knowing that Amir was slipping further away from me. I was certain if I had one more chance to talk to him, I could reach him, but it seemed he was too scared to back out of the engagement. Amir no longer bothered to even take my calls. I knew why, but it didn't make it any easier. What I didn't expect was for the news that Amir and the dean's daughter were getting married by the weekend to spread like wildfire. Panic and desperation clawed at me. I had to do something. I decided to sneak into the professor's office and wait until we were alone so I could try to convince him one last time. The building was mostly empty when I slipped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. I hid in a corner of his office, waiting for him to arrive. It took about an hour, but when Amir finally entered, he was shocked to find me lying in wait. "Yusuf, what are you doing here?" he asked, surprise evident in his voice. "Amir, you can't go through with this," I said, standing up and facing him. "Marriage should be for love, not for transactions." "Yusuf, stop this. It's not that simple," Amir began, but I cut him off. "It is that simple. You're sacrificing your happiness for what? For research? For a career? None of that will matter if you're too miserable to enjoy them." Halfway through my impassioned plea, the door opened, and the dean and Layla walked in. The dean's eyes widened in shock when he saw me. "What is a student doing here at this hour?" he demanded, clearly taken aback. I was just leaving, sir," I stammered, but Layla's eyes blazed with fury when she saw me. "No, you are not," she all but shrieked. "Get out now," she ordered, pointing to the door. I spared Dr. Amir one last pleading look before I walked out. As I shut the door behind me, I heard her give Amir an ultimatum. "Either Yusuf gets expelled or the wedding is off." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I froze as I pressed my ear to the wood, straining to hear Amir's response. "Layla, please." Amir's voice was low and pleading. "He is a very brilliant student. Expelling him would be wrong." "Wrong?" Layla's voice was sharp. What's wrong is you sneaking around with a student behind my back. Choose, Zahir, him or the wedding. The dean tried to mediate, his voice calm but firm. Layla, let's not be too hasty. We don't have the full picture here. We need to handle this delicately. But Layla was frantic, her voice rising in pitch. No, Dad, this is unacceptable. He made his choice when he started this affair. I will not marry a man who cannot sacrifice something as meager as his plaything for this transaction. Silence stretched on the other side of the door. I held my breath waiting for Amir's decision. When it came, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it was clear. Fine. I'll let him go. My heart shattered. I turned and I ran. I ran like I never had before, tears spilling down the corner of my vision as I blindly made my way back to my dorm. Once I arrived, I sank into my bed and cried until I lost consciousness. I had lost Dr. Amir and my education in one fell swoop. The following weekend. As the weekend rolled in, I was stricken with fear, realizing that my days in school were now numbered. The importance of the wedding to Amir's ambitions was clear, and the thought of being expelled loomed over me like a dark cloud. I didn't want any fanfare. I didn't need school security dragging me out of the school hostel. Things like that always ended up being immortalized on social media. So, to avoid all of the drama, I packed my bags and left the school premises by Friday evening. Thankfully, both my parents were out of town for a business meeting. I had some time on my hands to come up with a credible reason for quitting school in the middle. I stayed glued to my phone all weekend, waiting on two things: the inevitable expulsion letter and the huge social media splash that would follow after Amir's wedding. By Sunday evening, neither were yet to come in. I couldn't bring myself to call Dr. Amir, so I did the next best thing. On Monday, I dared to return to campus, bracing myself for the worst. Instead, I was met with hushed whispers and stares all over campus. It wasn't until I overheard some students talking that I learned the shocking news. Dr. Amir had called off the wedding and quit his position as anthropology professor. I couldn't believe it. Why did he quit? This meant a lot to him. Why would he throw it all away at the dying moment? Later that night, as I contemplated going back to Dr. Amir's house, my phone buzzed with a message from him, asking to meet at the park. My heart leaped. I had missed hearing from him. It almost brought tears to my eyes. I hurried to our rendezvous point. The park wasn't too far from my hostel. It was a 20-minute walk, so I decided to run. When I arrived about 10 minutes later, Amir stood there with a small duffel bag in hand, his expression lighter than I had seen in a very long time. Dr. Amir, what's going on? I asked breathless. He smiled, easily shrugging. I called off the wedding, he said quietly. I quit my job, too. I stepped closer to him, fear evident in my eyes. Why would you do that? What about your research? Dr. Amir shrugged yet again. I realized it wasn't as important as protecting you from being expelled. You're a brilliant student, Yusuf, and I couldn't let them ruin your future. He rubbed the back of his neck nervously. Also, because I really like you, he confessed. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I tackled him in a hug. I'm so sorry, Dr. Amir. This is all my fault. Amir laughed. It's not. It's really not. I don't know what I was thinking getting into a transaction like that in the first place. I tightened my hold on him. What will you do now? I asked, my voice choked with emotion. I'm going to New York, Amir replied. I have colleagues in schools there that owe me favors. I can start fresh. Stay, I pleaded, my voice trembling. Please stay with me, Dr. Amir. Dr. Amir shook his head, a sad smile playing on his lips. There's nothing left for me here now, Yusuf. But after you graduate in a year, if you still want to do this, come find me in New York. He leaned in and kissed me gently, and I clung to him, knowing our time together was slipping away. The kiss held all the promises and goodbyes we couldn't put into words. When we finally pulled apart, Amir looked into my eyes, his gaze steady. Promise me you'll focus on your studies and graduate, he said, his hand cupping my cheek. Promise me you'll make the most of this opportunity. I promise, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I'll get this degree and come find you, even if it's the last thing I do. We stood there for a moment longer, memorizing each other's faces in the dim park light. Then, with one last hug, Amir turned and walked away, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Every day for the next year, I threw myself into my studies with renewed vigor, keeping Amir's words close to my heart. I would see him again, and this time we would have a chance to build a life together. The year was a long one. Undoubtedly, I still had to deal with Layla as she became the new anthropology professor. Thankfully, the dean was diligent enough to ensure she didn't academically bully or mess with me. By the end of the school year, I graduated top of the class and valedictorian. The end. Do you think Yusuf went too far at any point? Do you think you could go this far to win the affection of the one you love? Thanks for watching. Consider liking and subscribing to become part of our Rainbow Force. And stay wholesome.